It was the best of times. It was the worst of times. It was a time of COVID neurosis and a time to party like it was 2019. Yes, it was my first-hand experience of going to the United States after spending 2 years in COVID-crazy Australia. I'm James Morrow. Welcome to the very first Busting the Narrative 2022. Now, it is hard to explain to outsiders just how paranoid Australia is about COVID, even compared to New York City, my old hometown. You know, we have spent 2 years locked down on this island, and only a few of us have gotten to leave up until just this past December. Going to a place like New York City, well, you wouldn't believe it. Yes, this is, of course, the place that was the ground zero of the Omicron outbreak. It was the place that was doing thousands and thousands of cases a day and where we were told was the most hot spot of all the hot spots in the United States. And yet, for all of this, New York City was comparatively normal compared to Australia. Going out in the city, well, I'll tell you what, bartenders, you talk to them, they said if they hadn't caught it already, they wanted to catch the Omicron variant, saying they knew that this was far less severe than other versions such as Alpha or Delta. Nightlife was absolutely pumping in much of the city. While many restaurants and bars had closed, those that were open were doing banner trades. The same thing for live music, where people were crowded into jazz bars down in the village and going to concerts all over town. A great far cry from Australia, where you can't even do what I enjoyed doing in Soho one night, which was smoke a cigar indoors. But while I was there, of course, the world was transfixed by the saga of Novak Djokovic, the tennis player, and I can't even begin to explain to you how weird this all seemed to Americans who looked at Australia and said, not only is this supposedly libertarian, free-spirit, risk-taking country, but also a country that is nearly fully vaxxed. And they asked me over and over again, what threat could this fellow have posed? And I'll tell you what, nearly every American I encountered, hearing I lived in Australia, asked just what the heck happened down there. And yes, they all said heck, because they're Americans and they're polite. But the great illustration of the mindset of Australia versus America, where everybody had it or knew that they would, versus Australia, was even more prevalent in the American South. I traveled down through Charleston, South Carolina, and Savannah, Georgia. And there I can tell you that you only saw masks in the most touristy of areas or in federal parks that were managing areas such as the Fort Sumter Battleground in South Carolina, where the first shots of the Civil War were fired. Now, of course, there were still neurotics, and there are many fights going on still over masks in the United States. For example, in Virginia, where Governor Youngkin has just taken power and tried to ban masks in schools, well, teachers are threatening and bullying kids who aren't wearing masks with punishment and being put in the equivalent of rubber rooms where they won't get any sort of education. In New York State, where I was at the start of my trip, the governor is fighting to keep masks despite courts saying, no, you don't have any power to do that. In Colorado, parents are speaking out saying, you know what, we don't want our children to be forced to spend 6, 8, 10 hours a day in masks when, of course, in the rest of society, people aren't doing anything of the sort. But even with all of that, there's a big difference between Australia and the United States, and that is this. Americans are far more willing to push back against and question COVID rules that have gone from being about benign safety in many people's minds to control. But even here in New South Wales, Australia, things are changing. QR codes, which we were supposed to be using everywhere we went, well, the state premier has announced that they aren't even using them to check, and they are just putting them around for people to have, quote unquote, confidence.
It's effective on confidence. We're not tracking and tracing. We made that very clear. There's a high risk venue, then that, the health team in those circumstances may track and trace. But we are, in the main, we are not.
And even the state of Western Australia, which has been hermetically sealed from much of the country, if not the world, for almost 2 years now, is starting to open up, with people there saying that, by a margin of 51%, that they would think that the state should have done more to open up. So here we are, the pandemic coming to a close, and yet in Australia, it's still dragging on. Thanks for watching. Please like, share, and subscribe below, and I'll see you next week.